Hello and welcome back to the 20th episode of Greek Speaks. I cannot believe I've done this 20 times, holy crap. Today we are talking about Theseus and Minotaur and kind of the founding of Athens, and it's going to get a little bit into the history, but we're going to talk about Theseus, who is probably like third of my favorite heroes. I haven't ranked them like I have the gods, but I like Theseus. He's chill, especially if it's just a standalone myth. Now, when you get to like Hippolytus, which is going to have his own video eventually, he's a little more crazy. Something I forgot to mention last week is that there's this idea of lateral and then vertical comparison. So lateral so one of them is when you take the Greek hero's life like it's played out. So like if you read a book of myths, from point A to point B, that's lateral, their life. But vertically is when you compare them all to each other. So like you would compare Theseus in the Minotaur myth, and you would compare Theseus in the play Hippolytus, and the Oedipus play that he appears in. So that's another thing I forgot to mention last week. I'm sorry. So Theseus is the main hero of Athens in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, he is very tied into that history, and in the 8th century, when all of the Greek cities started forming hegemony, which hegemony is basically the idea of just one central city-state, it's where we get the polis city-state idea, and Theseus, for a really long time, was kind of conscripted, or like, was given credit that was hegemony, was that idea. So into the man himself, his father was this king named Augeas, who was the king of Athens, or he is the son of Poseidon. There is some debate, differing versions. So he's either completely mortal, a demigod, or... So in some cases he's the son of Aethra, Augeas, and Poseidon. So there's a trio. The Greeks didn't really care about biology. Also, it was the ancient world, so like biology wasn't a thing in that case. Grows up with his mom. Before his dad left to go back to Athens, his dad said, hey, if the baby's a boy, I'm going to stash a sword and some sandals underneath this huge rock, and then when the boy grows up, send him to Athens. And so Theseus does this, figures out he's the heir of Athens, and says, okay, I'm going to claim my birthright. And that's kind of the last we hear of Aethra. I don't know how to say her name, I'm sorry. He could have sailed to Athens in this time, and it would have been a lot safer, which is not something you get to say a lot about sailing. But from wherever Theseus was alive to Athens are a bunch of bandits in the road. So there's this guy named Procrusteus. He has 2 beds, and they're each exactly 6 feet long. So if you are longer than 6 feet, he'll put you on one bed and, cut off what's falling off. And then if you're shorter than 6 feet, like me, you would put this on this other bed and it would stretch you. Further along down the road, there is this guy named Theseus who would bend pine trees backward and make you hold them in place, and eventually he would tie you to them, and then when you're done and you got too tired to hold the pine trees down, they would rip you in half. So this dude is crazy. I meant to mention on the Procrusteus that Theseus defeats Procrusteus by putting him on his bed and killing him. He kills this dude by tying him to a pine tree and letting him rip. There's definitely a sort of like eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of thing. And lastly, the other bandit that Theseus runs into is this guy named Skyron, who lives on the edge of a cliff, and he has a giant pet turtle that is below the cliff. And Skyron would make people wash his feet. And when they were doing this and they were off balance, he would kick people off of the cliff and have his turtle eat them. No surprise, Theseus somehow beats this guy in like a wrestling match or something and feeds him to his own turtle. Can't say the Greeks weren't creative, that's all I'm going to say. Eventually, Theseus gets to Athens, and he gets to the palace, and he's starting to have a banquet, and Medea, who is the now wife of Augeas, who is in the story of Jason and the Argonauts, so we can do that. We get her backstory. Yay. Anyway, so Medea is kind of power hungry and wants her son to be the next king of Athens after Augeas, Medea somehow knows who Theseus is and poisons his cup at the festival. And Augeas, at like the very last second, realizes that Augeas knows that Medea has poisoned this cup. And at the very, very last second, Augeas sees that Theseus has his sword and his sandals, and Augeas like slaps the cup out of Theseus' hand, and Medea, escapes Athens, and in some cases goes into Persia, because like the Proto-Persians, the people who kind of resided in that area were something called the Maenids or something like that. They have the same root as Medea. Augeas and Theseus decide that Theseus is going to be the next king of Athens and start treating him as prince. Well, Athens has this deal with Crete that is not very favorable to the Athenians. Essentially, the Prince of Crete was somehow killed on a trip to Athens, and Athens now has to give tribute to Crete every 7 years. And they have to give tribute in the form of 7 young men and 7 maidens, because they have the Minotaur. You knew that was coming. How the Minotaur was born. This is always my favorite story to tell, because it's so weird. But essentially, the king of Crete, Minos, had this bowl that was really, really, really pretty. And the thing about sacrifice to the gods is you gave the best of the best. So, when it came around time to sacrifice to Poseidon, which bulls are a symbol of Poseidon, and were just good things to sacrifice in a public setting in general, because then you would eat the sacrifice and you have to feed a bunch of people, you do a bull. If Minos was doing things properly, he would have sacrificed this bull to Poseidon, but he didn't. And Poseidon is just like, okay, you like your bull? I'm going to make your wife really like your bull. So Poseidon makes the queen, Pasiphae, fall in love with the bull, which, it gets weirder. There is this mechanic, engineering, amazing human being. Think of like mechanic, but on steroids. He knows how to build things, he knows how to make things well, and he just knows everything. And then there's this guy called Daedalus that works for King Minos. And the queen goes to Daedalus and says, look, I really want to have sex with this bull, so if you could make me a cow costume that I could get inside of it to have sex with this bull, that'd be great. And for some reason, Daedalus does it. I get it's your queen, but also, what? This is the story I always tell to people, and I'm like, hey, the Greeks were freaking weird. Anyway, and I remember at one point I told my friend about this, and we had a 15-minute long debate on whether or not Pasiphae was a furry or not. That's what you get when you know me. I'm a weird person. Anyway, more importantly, so this bull costume gets made, she goes out in the field with the bull, and 9 months later you have a Minotaur. Yay. When I was looking into this story for my book, actually, I figured out that the gestation period between humans and bulls are really similar. So, dispelling all, the chromosomes and the ethical and the biological stuff, this could theoretically work just based on gestation period. The bull in question becomes the Bull of Marathon, and this also lends credence to a theory that this myth was propaganda for the Athenians against the Cretans, because they're not civilized, they're sleeping with animals, and also, if the Minotaur is half man, then technically isn't him eating humans kind of cannibalism? Which cannibalism was a big no-no in ancient Greece, like it is today. Part of the reason that Athens has to make this deal with Crete is, this is set in the Mycenaean period. Well, Crete, in the Minoan Crete, was immensely powerful in the Mycenaean period. Athens and Thebes and Sparta and a lot of the things we think of as ancient Greece, in our view, don't really become powerful players until the 8th century. So prior to that, before the Bronze Age collapsed, Crete was a huge player. It's actually really, really, really interesting. Getting back to Theseus, Theseus says, I'll be one of the 7 men to go to fight, and I'm going to go kill the Minotaur. And Augeas doesn't want to give up his heir, and so Augeas, tries to convince him not to, but Theseus has to be an epic moral hero, and he decides that he's going to go. But before he leaves, he tells Augeas, hey, I am going to change the sails from black to white when we come back, so that you know I'm alive. Because usually there would be black sails for mourning. So, they sail to Crete, and the Ariadne, who is the daughter of King Minos and Queen Pasiphae, falls in love with Theseus. So Ariadne goes to Daedalus, who's probably very done with this family. And, there's another story about Daedalus that, is even more done with his family. Also, Daedalus has had to build this gigantic labyrinth in Crete to house the Minotaur, and that's where we get the word labyrinth. There's also some evidence that the Palace of Minos could be inspiration for the labyrinth, because it was so weird, and there's rooms inside of rooms, and there's hallways that lead to nothing, and it's before modern electricity, so it's very dark, and it's very crowded, and so that's kind of where the theory is that palace inspired the labyrinth part of the myth, which I totally agree with, just FYI. So anyway, so Ariadne goes to Daedalus and says, hey, I'm in love with this guy, how am I going to do this and save this person I'm in love with? And Daedalus says, okay, give him this. And he gives her this ball of string, which is still used in, diving techniques, and, that's the idea of, Hansel and Gretel. You're going to leave a string of breadcrumbs. So, Ariadne goes to Theseus' cell and says, hey, I'm in love with you. I want you to take me back to Athens when this is all done. And if you survive, I want to marry you. And Theseus says, okay. So, eventually, Theseus is, led to the labyrinth, and he ties the string to the front of the gate and starts walking into the center of the labyrinth. And he finds the Minotaur at the center of the labyrinth, and they wrestle, and eventually Theseus kills him. Which is really sad, because the Minotaur has had a really rough life, and it's not his fault that a god wanted to take vengeance on his stepdad. My theory is none of the monsters in Greek mythology deserved it. Unless they're born like that, Cerberus is born a three-headed dog. Being the guard dog of Hades makes sense. But, Medusa and the Minotaur don't really deserve the fates they got, because they're just products of, crappy world circumstances. Theseus survives and walks back out of the maze and gets all the rest of the Athenians and gets Ariadne and books it for the harbor. So they sail back, and they stop on this little island named Naxos, and Theseus, for some reason, be it wasn't thinking, had to leave hurriedly, whatever, leaves Ariadne asleep on Naxos. So eventually Dionysus finds Ariadne and they get married, which is really sweet to a degree. Theseus starts sailing back to Athens from Naxos, and for some reason, grief, whatever, he forgets to change the sails from black to white. And so that's the other dude. And so Augeas sees black sails when he's looking out from the Palace of Athens and throws himself off of a cliff and drowns, and that's why it's the Aegean Sea. And so Theseus becomes king of Athens, and he gets credited with the Synechism, which is another word for hegemony. So he's credited with bringing together Athens, and he's credited with bringing in the Pan-Athenic Festival, which was this huge festival to Athena in Athens, and he's credited with making the assembly and sort of founding democracy, which I'm kind of mad about, because there's this one Athenian politician named Solon who's actually that guy, and he's so cool, and I love him, so I'm a little bit miffed that they gave it to this hero that isn't historical, because Solon's so cool. Again, I'm a massive nerd, so a lot of the story of Theseus and the Minotaur is about barbarity of Crete over the civilization of Athens, and there's a lot of otherness depicted in that. So yeah, and Theseus runs into the Amazons at some point, which gave birth to his son Hippolytus, but we'll get into that when I do a Hippolytus video. And there's one other story about Theseus that in no way, shape, or form will improve your understanding of Greek mythology, but it's just really funny. And my sister and I absolutely love this myth, and it's my channel, and I can do what I want. Theseus at some point has this buddy named Pirithous. And Pirithous gets the amazing idea that he and Theseus both deserve to marry daughters of Zeus. And so they go and abduct Helen of Troy. They bring her back to Athens, or wherever they're hanging out. And she's like 12 at this point, maybe. Which, for all of the embarrassing things the Greeks did, Theseus is like, okay, I don't want to marry a 12-year-old right now, but he does resign to keeping her until she's old enough to get married to. And Pirithous says, okay, we have your wife. I want to marry Persephone, goddess of the underworld, who, yes, is at this point married to Hades, which is not a good idea for multiple reasons. Hades is chill until you majorly piss him off, and then he rightfully rips you a new one. Especially in this case. So anyways, they trek down to the underworld, and Hades is there, standing there, being like, okay, you want my wife, get out. And they're just being like, oh, hello. So you want my wife, do ya? And so Hades invites them in and like sits them down at the dining table. And is like, oh, okay, Persephone. And he's gone for like 5 minutes, and Theseus and Pirithous go to get up, and they realize they can't because their butts are glued to Hades' dining table chairs. And so they're stuck for God knows how long until Hercules comes to the underworld on his last trial and rips Theseus off of the chair. And then he goes to rescue Pirithous, and a giant earthquake happens. So Hercules is kind of like, okay, I get the message. And he and Theseus leave Pirithous in the underworld, so, like, theoretically, Pirithous is still there with his butt glued to Hades' dining chair. I love mythology. It's just so out there, and so, like, you really needed a story about that, but I love that you do. Don't worry about Helen of Troy. Helen of Sparta, she gets rescued by her brothers, Castor and Pollux, and it's fine. I mean, it's not fine in, like, 10 years when the Trojan War happens, but, like, this time it's fine. So, yeah, that is Theseus, the king of Athens, and the guy who was stuck in the underworld for, like, 5 years, or however long. Again, he's not my favorite. We'll come back to him. I mean, he's not my, like, least favorite. Least favorite is probably Bellerophon, just because he's always seemed like this whiny little kid to me. I don't know. I just don't like him. And Perseus is my boy. I love Perseus. So, Theseus is, like, dead center for me. I don't know. I need to rank them. I need to, like, read all of them and rank. But yeah, that is Theseus. As always, if you have any myths you want me to talk about, leave it in the comments below. I'll try to get to it. And have a good week.